Yesterday's lesson, we looked at how to use models to subtract mixed numbers. Today, we're going to be looking at how we can subtract mixed numbers from mixed numbers or fractions from mixed numbers. And we're going to do this by finding the least common denominator, regrouping, and then simplifying our fractions to lowest terms. And so the first problem that we're going to take a look at is on page 425, and it says Evan walks 2 1/8 miles to his aunt's house. He's already walked 3/4 of a mile. How much further does he have to go? And so this went ahead and put it in a bar diagram. So this right here, this top part represents the total. That's how much he has to walk. 3/4 represents how far he has already walked, and X represents how far he still needs to go. So to solve for this unknown value, or to solve for X, we're going to go ahead and we're going to subtract out. So I'm going to set my problem up vertical. So I have 2 1/8, and I'm going to subtract 3/4. Now, just like when we subtracted when we added mixed numbers, you're going to want to start with the fraction first, especially if you're going to have to do regrouping. And so in order to determine whether or not you're going to have to regroup or not is you need to look at the top fraction of the number that you're subtracting from. And so when I look at 1/8, I'm going to look at 1/8, I'm going to compare it to 3/4, and I have to say which fraction's larger. So 3/4 is the larger fraction. And so because 3/4 is the larger fraction, I am going to need to regroup. Now, regrouping with fractions looks a lot different than what you have been doing with regrouping your entire mathematical career, because you've been regrouping to a place value of 10, where every value is 10. I have 10 ones, it makes a 10. I have 10 tens, it makes 100. Fractions look a little bit different. So for this problem, I'm not going to be regrouping to a place value of 10. I'm going to look at the denominator. I'm going to be regrouping to a place value of 8. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cross out the 2, make it a 1. Now, with the numerator, I'm going to cross out the 1, and I'm going to add whatever value I had in the numerator to the denominator to give me my new value for the numerator. So here I had 1, so I'm going to do 1 plus 8, and I get 9. So it's not going to be 18. I'm not going to just it's not going to be 11. I'm not just going to put a 1 next to here. I have to add the denominator to the numerator, and then that will give me my new value. It'll give me an improper fraction. So from here, I can go ahead and I can multiply, but I need to get it into a common denominator. And so again, if you need to list off your multiples, you're going to be listing off your multiples off on the side. And so if I list off, I have 4, 8, 12. Well, 8 is what's in common. I can already see without having to list off 8, 8's what's in common. So 9/8 is going to stay the same. And then 3/4 is going to equal 6/8. And then I'm going to do the same process if I was adding, except now I'm subtracting. I'm going to take the numerator. So I'm going to do 9 subtract 6, and I get 3. So I'm going to write this over here. I get 3/8, and then I worry about the whole number. So it's going to be 1 subtract nothing. I don't have anything there, so it's going to be 1. So my answer here is going to be 1 3/8 miles. So he has 1 3/8 miles to go. Okay. So if we take a look at your next problem, so the next problem that we're going to look at is on page 426. A golf ball measures about 1 2/3 inches across the center. What is the difference between the distance across the center of the hole and the golf ball? So if I put this in a bar diagram, I'm looking at 4 1/4 is my total, and that's going to be the distance of a golf ball hole, or a hole on a golf course. And then the golf ball is going to measure 1 2/3 inches. And then the difference between the two distances is going to be our unknown. So it's going to be X. So I'm going to set this problem up vertically. So I have 4 1/4, subtract 1 2/3. So again, my very first step that I'm going to do is I'm going to compare fractions. And the reason that I compare fractions is I'm going to determine whether or not I need to do regrouping. So when I compare fractions, I compare 1/4 to 2/3. I have to ask myself which fraction is larger. 1/4 is the larger fraction. So that means I need to go ahead and I need to regroup. So I'm going to cross off the 4. Now, this time our denominator is not 8. Our denominator is going to be 4. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add these two values together. And so I'm going to add 4 plus 1. So I'm going to cross off the 1 and make that a 5. So my new fraction that I have is now 5/4. Then I look for common denominators. So when I look for common denominators, what I have is 3 and 4. So if I need to list off my multiples, I'm listing off my multiples to the side until I find a common. If I already know what my common multiple is, then you're just multiplying. So the common denominator is going to be 12. So my least common denominator is going to be 12. And then how I get there is 3 times 4 is equal to 12. So 2 times 4 is going to be equal to 8. And then 4 times 3 is equal to 12, which means 5 times 3 is going to be equal to 15. Now I subtract. So 15 subtract 8 is going to be 7/12. And then I worry about my whole number. So I forgot to put the 3 up there. Make sure you do that step. So it's going to be 3 subtract 1, and I end up with 1, 3 subtract 1 is going to be 2, not 1. And I end up with 2 and 7/12. So the whole is going to be 2 and 7/12 inches wider. So the process for adding and subtraction, except for the addition and subtraction part, is going to be the same. The difference is with that regrouping. So I'm going to compare those fractions. I'm going to regroup if necessary. Then I'm going to create equivalent fractions. And then I'm going to solve. Okay. And so that's very sloppy. And so that's the step that we're going to work through. All right. So the next one that we have is the convince me. It says estimate 8 1/3, subtract 3 3/4. And this, when we look at this, tell how you got your estimate. Susie subtracted and found the difference to be 5 and 7/12. Is her answer reasonable? So what we're going to look at is I'm going to take 8 1/3, and I'm going to say that 8 1/3 is going to be close to 8.5. And 3 3/4 is going to be close to 4. So 8 1/2 subtract 4 is going to be 4.5. She got an answer of 5 and 7/12. That's not a reasonable answer. The answer needs to be closer to 4.5 than 5 and 7/12. Okay. So if we were to find the actual difference, so let's go ahead and find the actual difference. So I have 8 and 1/3. I'm just going to write 4.5 as a frame of reference. So I have 8 and 1/3, and I'm subtracting 3 and 3/4. First step I'm going to do is I compare my fractions. So I have 1/3 and 3/4. 1/3 is a smaller fraction, so I need to regroup. So 8 becomes 7. The 1, I add 1 plus 3, and I get 4. Look for common denominator. Common denominator is going to be 12. And so when we look at our common denominator, 4 times 3 gets to 12. So 3 times 3 is going to be 9. 3 times 4 equals 12. So 4 times 4 is going to be 16. 16 subtract 9 is going to be 7/12. And then 7 subtract 3 is going to be 4 and 7/12. So here our answer is a reasonable answer because it is very close to 4 and 1/2. Another example on page 427, it looks a little bit different. So I have 6 subtract 2 and 3/8. So when I am subtracting a mixed number from a whole number, the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to rename the 6 into a fraction form. So to do that, I'm going to look at the denominator of my fraction, which is going to be 8, and I'm going to create a whole number. So if you recall, a whole is where the numerator and the denominator are the same value. So when I did that, I'm going to take a whole away from 6. I wrote it in fraction form, and then so I have 5 left over. So my new fraction is now going to be 5 and 8/8, and I'm subtracting 2 and 3/8. So this is going to be my new problem, and then I just simply subtract. So I have 8 subtract 3. I end up with 5/8. 5 subtract 2 is going to be 3. So my answer is 3 and 5/8. So my very first step is to go ahead and just regroup by renaming the 6 as a fraction with a whole number. I'm sorry, with representing a whole number by having the numerator and denominator be the same value. All right. So we're going to jump over to number 3. And so when we take a look at number 3, it says estimate and then find each of the difference. So I would like for you guys to do your estimation skills, as that's something that needs to be practiced. So I have 3 and 5/6. I'm sorry, 7 and 2/3 subtract 3 and 5/6. And so what I'm going to do is 7 and 2/3 is close to 8. 3 and 5/6 is going to be close to 4. So 8 subtract 4. My answer should be somewhere around 4 in order to be reasonable. So the first thing I need to do is I need to see whether or not compare to regroup. So 2/3 and 5/6. I need to see which fraction is going to be the larger fraction, and it's going to be 5/6. And so one way that if you're not sure that you can do that is to go ahead and turn them into equivalent fractions. So if I turn this into an equivalent fraction and say 4/6, now I'm comparing with the same denominator. 4 is smaller than 5, so I need to go ahead and I need to regroup. So I'm going to cross out the 7, I'm going to cross out the 4, and I'm going to add 6 plus 4, and I get 10/6. And so 5/6 is going to stay the same. Now I subtract. 10 subtract 5 is going to be 5/6. And then 6 subtract 3 is going to be 3 and 5/6. 3 and 5/6 is near 4, so our answer is going to be reasonable. Okay. Next problem that we have is we have 5 subtract 2 and 3/4. So 2 and 3/4. So I'm just going to do 5 subtract 3. So my answer should be around 2 to be a reasonable answer. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to rename the 5. And so when I rename the 5, it gets renamed as 4. And then I look at my denominator, it's 4. So 4 and 4/4. And then the 2/3 the 3/4 stays the same. So it becomes 2 and 3/4. I subtract, and I end up with 1/4. And then 4 subtract 2, I get 2. So my answer is going to be 2 and 1/4, which is reasonable with my answer of 2. Okay. Next one, you're going to want to go ahead and make it vertical. So I have 6 and 3/10, subtracting 1 and 4/5. And so looking at common, or I have 6 and 3/10. 3/10 is very close to 0. So I'm going to do 6, 1 and 4/5. That's very close to 2. So I'm going to do 6 subtract 2. My answer should be around 4. So I now look and I compare to see if I need to regroup. 3/10 is a smaller fraction than 4/5. So I'm going to cross off the 6, make that a 5, cross off the 3. Again, I'm going to add 10 plus 3, and I get 13 tenths. Common denominator is going to be 10. 5 times 2 is going to be 10. So 4 times 2 is going to be 8. 13 subtract 8 is going to be, so let me just write this over here so you guys can see it. 13 subtract 8 is going to be 5/10. 5 subtract 1 is going to be 4. So my answer is 4 and 5/10. And I'm hoping here you recognize that this fraction can be reduced because 5 and 10 share a common factor of 5. So I'm going to divide 5/10 by 5, and I end up with 1/2. So my answer is going to be 4.5. So when you're writing your answers, because these problems can get messy, Write your answer in lowest terms, and then circle it for me if you've got a lot of work going, please, so I can very easily see it. Okay, the last